General Hindenburg, distinguished guests, members of the Connecticut National Guard, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is George Ripley. I'm the chairman of the Connecticut Militia Heritage Council, and I am delighted to welcome you to today's program, Living Their Enemies, Dying Their Guests. At the outset, I want to thank our partners and the sponsors of today's event, the Connecticut State Library and the Connecticut Military Department. Without their guidance and support, our military history program would not be possible. How about a round of applause for these great organizations and the important work they do for us every day. I would also note that today's program is being filmed by CTN, the Connecticut Network, and they have filmed many of our programs. They always do a great job. Their talented crews are just outstanding. And remember, through CTN, we are able to make our programs available to those who are unable to be with us in person. So again, how about a hand for CTN? At this time, to say a few words, it is my privilege and honor to introduce a charter member of the Connecticut Militia Heritage Council and its predecessors, and a steadfast supporter of our military history program and programs, the Assistant Adjutant General, Army, Brigadier General Ralph Hindenburg.
Thanks, George. On behalf of the Adjutant General, Major General Fran Yvonne, and over 4,500 soldiers and airmen of the Connecticut National Guard, I'm pleased to welcome you to this afternoon's program that turns the clock back to the Revolutionary War and focuses on young men who fought and died during the struggle that created our nation. Our military history program helps bring the rich heritage of our citizen soldiers to life so that the lessons from the past are kept in mind as we struggle with the challenges of today. I would also like to thank the State Library, sponsors of today's events. Our partnership with the State Library and the Museum of Connecticut History has resulted in many great historical presentations over the past 26 years, and we very much appreciate the professionalism, imagination, and energy that the State Library has brought to this effort. Of particular note has been the work of Dave Corrigan and Christina Pitsley. While today's program focuses on a chapter of Connecticut's military history that may seem somewhat remote from the challenges and threats we face today, the fact is that while some of the faces may be different, the challenges and threats have not changed. Our response to those challenges and threats still relies on the bravery and resiliency of the young men and women in Connecticut and throughout the United States who serve in our armed forces. And anyone who is interested in joining the Connecticut National Guard may contact me personally, and I will put you in contact with one of our recruiters. You know, on a side note, George and I were talking earlier, back as a young 20-something-year-old, you know, about 25, 26 years ago, we first started working with Nick on then Camp Roland, maybe? Was it Roland? And Stone's Ranch.
Stone's Ranch.
Yes, and it was a tremendous honor and education to work with Nick way back then. Not way back then, because that sounds very bad, Nick. You know, a few years ago, working on that, and it became very helpful to our organization. You know, some of the facilities that we have built on Camp Net and in Niantic would never have been built without the work that Nick did with some of our soldiers and with his grad students back in the day. So again, it's great to see you again and have you here. So thank you all for your attendance today, and thank you for your continued support of our soldiers.
Today's event is notable for several reasons. Number one, this is the first in-person event that we have had that has been presented by the Connecticut Militia Heritage Council since the COVID-19 pandemic began in March of 2020. Our events in 2020 and 2021 were presented virtually in January 2021 and January 2022, respectively. We weren't able to get them in the actual year that they represent because doing virtual programs is a real challenge, and our assistant PAO person, Tim Coster, can tell you how much of a job it was. He did most of it, and it was a real challenge. So that's number one. Number two, this is the 36th public event that we've had since our first program in May 1996, National Guard Armories, the cornerstone of communities. I think you'll agree we've had a pretty good run. And finally, number three, it was 25 years ago on 17 October 1997 in this room that Dr. Nicholas Bellantoni, the state archaeologist, did a slide presentation for us on Camp Rowland and Stones Ranch. It was part of the Archaeology Awareness Week events. And 25 years ago, of course, to a person of my age, it seems like yesterday. But it's great to have him back and here with us for this year's event. To introduce our distinguished speakers, it's my pleasure to turn the program over to the Connecticut State Library's Special Projects Director, who is a member of the Connecticut Militia Heritage Council, and who was the project leader for the library's very successful World War I digitization project, Remembering World War I, Sharing History, Preserving Memories. And that's Christine Pitsley.
Thank you, everyone. I am, as always, honored to be here and excited to introduce some of my favorite people. So first, let's see. We're going to start with Dr. Nicholas Bellantoni. Dr. Nicholas F. Bellantoni serves as the Emeritus State Archaeologist with the Connecticut State Museum of Natural History at the University of Connecticut. He received his doctorate in anthropology from UConn in 1987 and was shortly thereafter appointed state archaeologist. He also serves as an adjunct associate research professor in the Department of Anthropology at UConn and is a former president of the Archaeological Society of Connecticut and the National Association of State Archaeologists. So he will do sort of the first presentation, which will then be taken up by Dr. Sarah Sportman, who is the current state archaeologist. Dr. Sarah Sportman holds a PhD in anthropology from the University of Connecticut and a master's degree in historical archaeology from the University of Massachusetts, Boston. She has worked as an archaeologist for over 20 years, studying the archaeology and history of Euro-American and pre-colonial indigenous groups in New England and New York. Before accepting the position of Connecticut State Archaeologist in 2020, Dr. Sportman worked as a cultural resource management archaeologist for CRM firms in Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New York, conducting archaeological projects related to construction and development. And most importantly, they will be working with us, and Sarah will be leading the dig for our next installment of Digging into History. And Connecticut National Guard was such a huge supporter of our last trip when we went to France to restore the World War I trenches of 102nd soldiers. So next year, we're really excited to be working with them on a project right here in Connecticut. So without further ado, Dr. Bellantoni.
Thank you. Thank Christine, and let's see what, hold on a second here. Okay, it's really great to be back, and it's hard to believe it's been 25 years, but I guess it has been, and it's quite a while. I want to dedicate this to my father, Frank, and so you older timers, I guess guys have been around a while will remember, he cut hair here at the Armory for over 40 years. And when I first got involved, everybody knew me as Frank's son. That, and I still am. I go around the state sometimes, and somebody will come up to me and say, your dad cut my hair, and he cut hair for over 73 years or something like that. So he appreciated coming here. He loved you guys, and we'd love, for his memory, we would love to dedicate this to him. Well, what we have for you is kind of an unexpected thing that happened to us. I should tell you, whenever the state archaeologist gets involved in these kind of human remains and burial situations, it usually starts as a police investigation, and that's exactly what happened here in in Ridgefield, Connecticut. They were doing construction, if you will. They were putting in an old house. There was an old house dating back to the 1790s, and what they were doing is it had a dirt floor basement, and they were grading that dirt floor in order to lay cement. They wanted to build a family room for their kids. So in the construction, they started to grade about 18 inches of soil, put down new gravel for the cement base, and they hit a human skull. And they stopped work immediately. Fortunately, the contractor contacted the property owner, who contacted the Ridgefield Police Department, who came down for the investigation, contacted the medical examiner's office in Farmington with the idea that maybe this was a homicide or a missing persons. When the state medical examiner sent their forensic anthropologist to the scene, recognized right away that this was not a modern criminal investigation, but that the remains themselves were older. That is to say, there was cortical loss and decomposition in the bone, which suggested the individual had been dead for well over 100 or more years. So as a result, it is at that point that the medical examiner will contact the state archaeologist, because the law is whenever human skeletal remains are uncovered in any capacity and it's reported to the police, if the medical examiner determines that the remains are 50 years old or more, not part of a modern criminal investigation, but most likely an unmarked grave, then the state archaeologist gets called in and conducts the investigation at that point. So that's how we arrived at the scene. But I just want to, below Christine mentioned about the work coming up, and of course the 250th anniversary of the Revolutionary War. But I wanted to just give you a quick timeline so we could put the raid on Danbury, or the Battle of Ridgefield, in which we believe these individuals were victims of, within context, and but also highlighting Israel Putnam's Reading Camp, the Battle of Fort Worcester in New Haven, the Battle of Fort Griswold in Groton, and the Rochambeau camps distributed through Connecticut. Not to go into all that history, but every one of those have had archaeological investigations as part of the research. So I just want to, make you aware that archaeology is a contributor to our understanding of military history, as well as the history of overall the state of Connecticut. So just to give you a little background on the battle, this is a time when, in April of 1777, when the British were in control of New York City. They had already invaded Washington, retreated with his troops, and in charge there was Major General William Tryon. As part of a campaign against the Patriots, they had gotten word that there was an arsenal up in Danbury, Connecticut, full of armament and gunpowder and so forth. So he decided that he would go up there as part of an initiative to destroy that, and he really hamper the militia, the Connecticut militia, in terms of their response during the war. So 1,900 British soldiers land at Campo Beach in Westport. They then march unimpeded to Danbury. When they get there, mission accomplished. They blow up the arsenal. But by this time, what ended up happening was that the Patriots were starting to respond. Word had gotten out that there was an invasion. And so word went out through the militias, and Benedict Arnold, General Silliman, in New Haven at the time, and David Worcester, the general at the time too, started to converge onto Ridgefield. The idea is they wanted to intercept the British as they were heading back to their ships. When Tryon gets word that the Patriots are mobilizing, he gets really upset, and he sets fire to like 16 houses in Danbury, burns them to the ground, and takes off back to his ships. So this is kind of a schematic, if you will, of the journey. The British ships are down here on the coast. They came upland, actually followed what today is almost Route 58, up into Danbury. And then they decided, at that point, Tryon decided instead of going back the same way, he would go back through a western route. And the reason was that in western Connecticut, there were a number of British sympathizers, or Tories, and he thought that the Tories would help them in their efforts to get back to their ships. But the Patriots do respond, and as a result, David Worcester Sullivan, Generals Worcester, Sullivan, and Arnold raise a force of 700 Continental Army regulars and farmers. And that's a very important part of this story, because some of these guys that were coming to assist were not part of the militia, or they were basically citizens. They were farmers, and they were coming off their farms to assist in the protection of Western Connecticut. So he takes off on the. So Worcester decides, he was in charge. General Worcester decides to split his army in two. The main body would go with Benedict Arnold and Sullivan to Ridgefield, and he would take a force of 200 soldiers and chase the Brits from the north, so kind of encompassing them. Sullivan and Arnold would get in front of the advance. Worcester would come in from behind and hopefully have them flanked. So this is what happens. Worcester attacks first from the north, again coming behind the British forces, and the first strike takes them by surprise, complete surprise. They had no idea that they had heard that the Patriots were mobilizing, but they had no idea that they were mobilizing this quickly. And then he pulls back and charges again and does another advance, but this time they're waiting for him. And he tells his boys, "Come on, boys, never mind such random shots," as the battle is starting. And he doesn't just about gets those words out when he gets mortally wounded by a musket ball. This is kind of a schematic showing what ended up happening next. Sullivan and Arnold set up a barricade. And this barricade was at a pinch point on Main Street in Ridgefield. If any of you have ever been there, coming up from the north, coming south, it kind of curves, comes up a ridge and down. And at that pinch point, they set up a barricade, which had a stone wall going through here, and it also had a ledge, a stone ledge with a swamp underneath. So it was a really good, advantageous point to trap the Brits as they were coming down the road, because there was very little area that they could assemble on. And the barricade was at the Benjamin Stebbins house. It not only served as a barricade, but it would serve as a hospital. Supposedly, 8 Patriots and 16 British soldiers were killed right at the barricade and buried on Stebbins' property. His house was scarred with cannons and bullets. He was a Tory. He was actually a British sympathizer. And the story is he and his family hid up in the attic during the whole battle. And the battle wasn't more than 15, maybe 20 minutes before the Brits breached the barricade. And then it became a running battle, if you will, going down Main Street through. Benedict Arnold, he was on our side back then. He was at the barricade with his soldiers, and he gets a horse shot out from underneath him. And there's a story that goes that he gets trapped. His horse falls and his leg is caught underneath. And so he's laying on the ground trying to free himself, and a British officer comes up to him, points a rifle in his face and says, "Do you surrender?" And Arnold says, "Not yet," and he pulls out a pistol and he shoots him before he could. And then he would free himself and retreat with his soldiers. There was running battles with the retreat going through the town, and you could just see that throughout the town of Ridgefield has been found many cannonballs, musket balls, armament, all the way through Main Street if you go there today. And there are historical markers. But this was a running battle going back as the Patriots retreated and reestablished themselves. So it's unclear the number of casualties that were involved. The Brits say they had about 27 rank and file were killed, 155 wounded. No formal tally was ever taken. General Sullivan, he says 9 to 10. Arnold's estimated 20. But the basic estimates today are 40 to 50 American deaths and 24 of them wounded. And there have been stories throughout the town about mass graves being there of the casualties on the battlefield, where they would strip the dead and bury them in shallow graves. And supposedly, again, 8 Patriots and 16 British soldiers are supposed to be buried out there, believed behind a stone wall that runs along Main Street in the area of the barricade. So in 1874, burials were discovered, but to the north of where Worcester attacked, and they were supposed to be surviving British. So again, we got called in, and when I got called at UConn and I was driving down there, I was very much aware of the Battle of Ridgefield, and that this male skeleton had been recovered by the medical examiner's office. And you know, I'm playing with the idea: could this be an individual that was, you know, he's supposed to be these unmarked graves of these war victims? But you know, you don't want to get too much into your head before you get to see the actual evidence. And so what I did was just try to divorce that from my mind and just see what I see and take it from there. And so what ended up happening when they found that first burial and understood that it was in fact old, we got called down into it. The medical examiner, the forensic anthropologist, Kristen Hartnett McCann, she did a bioanthropology analysis, if you will, the forensic analysis of the skeleton, determined it was an adult male between 25 and 45 years of age. When she measured the long bones, the statures were pretty good, 5'11", that's pretty tall back then. No signs of trauma, and there were no associated artifacts, no boots, buttons, buckles. There was nothing associated with any kind of clothing. When I got down there, we did some more work, and as we did, a second burial was uncovered. So now we had two individuals, and this was recovered about 15 feet south of the first skeleton. And the thing I noted right away is this was an east-west orientation, head to the west. That's kind of important because that is a classic Christian mortuary practice where you lay in the ground facing the east, and the idea is on the day of resurrection, Christ will come up with the sun out of the east and draw you from your housing, and you will share into the resurrection. So this was a Christian mortuary practice. So the other hypothesis becomes, well, maybe this is just a burial ground. Maybe this was a burial ground behind the house, because that original 1790 house had been expanded over the last 200 years. But we started our excavations with these two hypotheses that we might be looking at Revolutionary War burials or a family burying ground. Property owner couldn't have been more cooperative. The work stopped until we were finished, and because of the hard clay matrix of the soil, it took us well over a month to handle these remains. And of course, we were assisted by University of Connecticut students and volunteers from the Friends of the Office of State Archaeology, as well as the Archaeological Society of Connecticut. But you can see we had to work in some very cramped conditions within the cellar. And note the foundation stones, because it would turn out that some of these burials would actually go under the foundation. And that's when a third burial was uncovered. So now what we had were at least two individuals who are now, it was very clear, within the same grave shaft. And these guys were kind of commingled. That is to say, their arms and legs were overlapping each other, which kind of took away from the hypothesis of a family burying ground, because we found no evidence of coffin nails or hardware. Then I thought, well, maybe they could be hastily buried because of smallpox victims or so forth. But now what we were seeing is a mass grave. In this case right now, only two individuals. And you can see from our schematic how they overlaid each other. East-west orientations, but basically thrown in very quickly, where they were now overlapping each other. And we started with the second burial. We started to find buttons. These were, you know, brass, copperish. You could see the green stain that maybe from here, but also surrounded by this black texture. And what that turns out to be are the remains of textiles that preserved only because of the leaching of the copper salts into the soil, which helped neutralize the soil around it. This is a close-up. We had very hard-packed clay soils, which made it very, very difficult. And then another fourth burial was uncovered, again laying a very poor drawing from the field, but you could see the three individuals, and if you note where the round black circles are, that's where we were finding the buttons associated with those individuals. So two of them were completely naked, stripped. And we do know that the British would strip their dead that fell on battlefields because those uniforms, the armaments, the canisters, everything was extremely important. And they would strip them. We know from that happened in Lexington and Concord up in Massachusetts, where their fallen dead, they were quickly stripped, sometimes buried, sometimes left, and then they skedaddled, but they took as much as they could. Those things were very expensive, and they couldn't leave them on the battlefields. So we had two individuals that had some form of buttons, but those were all in the chest area. So whether they were waistcoats or what have you, there was nothing down lower in terms of boots or buckles or pants. And note here, this line represents the foundation. So these guys were actually under the foundation. It turns out in the 1980s, they expanded the house with a new wing. And in doing so, they inadvertently laid the foundation just above these guys. They never encountered them, but they were going now underneath, which made it an extremely difficult excavation. We called in our colleague Gary Aronson, a bioarchaeologist from Yale University, assisted with that. It was a very, especially getting that last individual out was extremely difficult. Total, we had 37 brass buttons, 2 pewter buttons. The burials were, 2 burials were stripped, 2 possibly had jackets or waistcoats on. And we also wanted to be sure that there were no further burials out there because we weren't quite sure the whole area. So we had our colleagues from the Natural Resources Conservation Service, Department of Agriculture. They came out with geophysical techniques, basically ground penetrating radar. They scanned the entire basement, and then they went out and scanned the yard for potential other burials. So the hypothesis is somewhat supported in that all the burials, all 4 of them, are adult, robust males. No women or children found in this very small sample. There were no signs of coffins, no signs of shroud pins or anything. And usually you do not put family burying grounds in clay, hard to dig. We see it in glacial tills, sandy soils. 2 individuals were stripped, 2 had pants, and of course the location is right on a historic battlefield that has stories of mass graves. The rejection of the hypothesis so far, and it hasn't been completed, is initially in the field we found no evidence of trauma. But that may change. Dr. Aronson and the universities that are now involved with the forensic evidence will be looking at those skeletal remains far better in the laboratory than we were able to, and that may change. We did not find any musket balls or firearms. Again, they could have been taken, and certainly no formal uniforms that Sarah now will talk to you about in terms of the analysis, where we are, and the analysis of especially those buttons and other material cultures.
Before I pick up where Nick left off, I just want to say thank you for inviting us to come and do this today. This is my first time at the Armory. I hope it won't be the last. I'm going to pick up the story, kind of talking a little bit about the artifacts once they got out of the field and we had the ability to get them cleaned up and pay a little bit of attention to them and figure out maybe what was going on with those. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about some of the next steps that are planned for the analysis of the human remains from these burials as we try to learn more about them, figure out who they are, and figure out how best to put them back to rest when this is all done. So, let's see. Oh, there we go. As Nick said, the initial excavations recovered 39 buttons from 2 of the burials. Those were the burials that we were referring to in the field as 2 and 4. And of those buttons, this is a little bit bigger. I don't know if you can see it in the back, but it's a little bit more blown up image than the one that Nick showed that shows the position of the buttons on these two burials that were right next to each other in the mass grave. 37 of those buttons were of brass alloy, 2 were of pewter. Those were really poorly preserved because pewter really doesn't hold up very well in the soil. So there's not a lot of detail about those. And as Nick said, you can see the kind of greenish tinge that showed up when they were excavating, which suggests the copper content of these buttons, as well as this dark staining around them that turned out to be some kind of fabric, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. But before I get into that, I just want to talk a little bit about archaeological artifacts when they come out of the ground, and conservation methods that are required to stabilize artifacts, particularly those made of metal. A lot of the artifacts that archaeologists deal with are more durable materials like ceramic and glass and stone that hold up really well in the soils, particularly here in New England where we have highly acidic soils that are really detrimental to preservation. But metals in general are inherently unstable, and they have a strong tendency toward corrosion. So basically, once they're in the ground, there's different minerals and water and all kinds of processes acting on them, and they start to corrode. But over time, they'll actually stabilize in that environment and kind of reach a point where they're not deteriorating any further until you take them out of the ground and expose them to the air and a new set of environmental characteristics, and then that process will kind of start up again. So it's oftentimes, even if you have pretty well-preserved metal artifacts coming out of the ground, it's important to get those conserved properly to prevent future deterioration, because people have done this with archaeological materials, put metal objects in bags and gone back a few years later and just found like basically crumbs or piles of dust. So we wanted to make sure that didn't happen here. So the artifacts from the Ridgefield burials were taken to Archaeological and Historical Services, which is a cultural resources management firm in Storrs, Connecticut, and they maintain a small on-site conservation lab for stabilizing artifacts. And they did that, they dealt with ours. They went through all the buttons and other materials that were recovered to make sure that they would be preserved. One, so we could get the information off of them if they had any information to provide, and two, that they would be intact so they could be part of the process moving forward. So as Nick said, the buttons were primarily up in the chest areas of the two burials that had them, and along the arms. All the buttons that were found turned out to be plain. There were no engraving or stamping or any kind of marks on any of them that would help us to determine, where they were made or when they dated to or things like that. But there was still lots of information even without that. Generally speaking, late 18th century men's clothing, going with the theory that these burials were related to the Battle of Ridgefield, had a lot of buttons. They were really common on men's clothing, more common than they were on women's clothing at the time. They were found on coats, waistcoats, jackets. People had them on sleeves and pockets, sometimes on their breeches down at the bottom at the knee, and sometimes shirt collars. So finding a large number of buttons is not at all surprising in an 18th century context. So these are just some examples from colonial Williamsburg of kind of typical men's garments at the time. Burial 2 had 13 buttons, and those were down the front, 10 down the front and 3 off to one side, and they were all pretty much identical. They were plain, they were copper alloy buttons, slightly convex in the back, basically flat, very undecorated, very plain. Not a lot of information there, but also very typical of the time period. The style of manufacture is very typical of the late 18th century. They fit right in with the expected time period of the Battle of Ridgefield. As I said, this burial also had 2 pewter buttons, but you can see from the photos here that they really didn't survive well at all. And there was very little information to be gleaned from those, and not much that they could do with them in terms of conservation. These are found near the rib area of burial 2. And as Nick mentioned, there were these dark stains as fabric or textile remnants on some of the burial 2 buttons. And this textile, it might be a fabric from a waistcoat or shirt that the buttons were attached to. Or another theory that we discussed was the possibility of cloth-covered buttons. These were things that people made and used in the 18th century. And, as Nick said, Cooper's metals can help to preserve the organic materials in acidic soils because of the copper salts. So the preservation of this was not necessarily surprising. You often find organic materials preserved next to copper artifacts. But the amount of detail that they were able to get off of this in the lab was really cool. So they took these pictures of the fabric under a microscope, and you can actually see kind of a crosshatch pattern. Excuse me. So, as I said, buttons with thread or cloth coverings could be made, were common in the 18th century. They could be made to match the color of cloth, so your jacket or waistcoat matched. And they could be covered with cloth or also with thread, wrapped with thread. So they consulted Adrian St. Pierre of the Barnum Museum, who's a textile specialist, and based on the photos, she identified the material as thread. So suggesting that these may have been thread-wrapped buttons, which were common. They were often called leek buttons. They were made in England, and they were common on waistcoats. But an interesting aspect of that is that if you look into the manufacture of these buttons, it's very uncommon for the thread to have been wrapped around a metal button. Because metal was expensive, it'd be far more likely for the thread or cloth-wrapped buttons to be made of something like wood or bone. So having a metal-wrapped button would be unusual. So, as we were thinking about these buttons and some of this stuff, I got talking to the curator at Fort Ticonderoga, Dr. Matt Hagel, and the archaeologist there, Margaret Stouter. And Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York on Lake Champlain has a tremendous collection of historic period military materials. They have uniforms and weaponry and all kinds of domestic artifacts from all of the years of occupation at the fort. Their collections are incredibly extensive and well maintained and open to researchers. So I took these up there to talk with them about the buttons that we'd found, and their perspective. They had a couple of interesting insights that I thought were worth sharing. One, they agreed that they didn't think that the buttons were probably thread wrapped. They thought it was far more likely that that material had been just adhered to the buttons from whatever it was laying against. Probably the garment in the same way, but not actually wrapped around the button, just kind of like stuck from the waistcoat or the jacket. The other thing they said about the buttons, these buttons and the other set, which I'm going to show you in a minute, was that they were very unlike anything that they'd encountered before in Fort Ticonderoga collections. So they didn't have anything, and we actually spent a good amount of time going through the drawers and looking at all the buttons that they had. And there was a lot of things that were similar, but nothing was quite like them. And their feeling was that those buttons were not military, that they were far more likely to be from civilian clothing rather than any kind of uniform. So, that was kind of a hint that we may be dealing with a citizen, a farmer, that was involved in the conflict but not part of the official military operation and didn't have an official uniform of any kind. Burial 4 had different buttons. It had 24 buttons down the chest, around the neck, and the arm. And these buttons were a different kind of manufacture. Instead of being those flat buttons, these were domed. These are two-piece buttons. You can see we had two complete ones there and one that actually separated. So you can see it's kind of hollow in the inside of the two pieces that fit together. These buttons are made out of tombac, which is a material that was developed in the 1760s. It became very common. So again, it's a good fit for the time period. But it's an alloy of copper and brass with high copper and zinc content. So again, these are buttons that are very common, but the folks at Ticonderoga once again said, they don't look like anything that we've seen on any kind of military uniform from the period. Again, they really thought that these were probably from civilian clothing. The other thing that Burial 4 had that was really interesting was initially categorized as a button. It's this little object here that you can see. It's also made of a brass alloy, but it has iron. This is iron set into it. And we had a couple of different theories about what that might be. Initially, one of the theories was that it might be from the base of a powder horn, that it would have been screwed into the bottom where you could hang a strap to carry your powder horn around your shoulder, and that maybe somebody had taken the powder horn off the body before it was buried, and then it got yanked out and fell down with the body. So that's a working theory, and it doesn't look bad when you look at this one in the picture, but they also have a massive collection of powder horns at Fort Ticonderoga from all periods, and there was really nothing that looked quite like that there either. So it raises kind of another interesting question about what this particular artifact might be, and why it was situated on a burial up near the shoulder. So theory 2, not a button. Maybe something else. So as I said, it was not similar to any of the powder horns in the collections at Fort Ty. It is actually a close match to furniture pulls documented from the period. So this is a picture right here of a couple of furniture pulls from 18th century Virginia sites from a book that was put together by a material culture specialist down there. It's a very close match for that. That was also the first instinct of the people at Ticonderoga. When I showed it to them, they said, oh, that's a furniture pull. And my question was, why was it in a burial? Because that didn't make a lot of sense. But another intriguing aspect of this artifact that I think really provides more questions than answers is that, a similar one was found at one of the Rochambeau campsites back when archaeologists did a survey of those in the 90s. So in Windham at Camp 47, they found a very similar artifact. So now you've got two of these in military contexts. And one theory that the archaeologists at Ticonderoga put forth is that, it might have been somebody who repurposed it as a coat button during the war, when things were hectic and they wanted to make sure that their coat was going to stay buttoned. So that's a possibility, that it was just basically a repurposed object, because it is, the end of it is basically the same size and shape as the buttons, and it probably would fit through a buttonhole and do that job. So that's another theory. But again, I guess with this one, it's still sort of, in some ways, a mystery object, although we have a couple of theories of being related to a powder horn furniture or possibly a repurposed button. So, So, as we move forward, we expect that there probably are some more artifacts to find. Some of the remains, when they were taken out of the ground, Nick talked about how they were in like a thick clay context. They were very difficult to excavate. So some of the remains were actually taken out with the soil matrix and brought to the lab that way. Some of them were cleaned in the Yale lab. The lab at Yale, you can see them doing that in the bottom photo there, with water, trying to carefully scrape the dirt away so as not to damage the bones. But there's also a lot of soil still left that needs to be wet screened, and that's something we're going to do at UConn this fall. So we have that material, and we've basically been waiting for a day when everybody's schedule and the weather aligns, because it's something that we have to do outside. So hopefully we'll get that done before it gets too cold. And we, we may very well find more buttons or other artifacts as we go through that soil. After that, moving forward now, the remains have been largely cleaned. We may also recover some small bone fragments and other materials as we go through that soil that will need to go back to Yale and be reunited with the burials. But the next steps is going to be basically utilizing an interdisciplinary team of specialists that we've put together to analyze the human remains, artifacts, and soil in a comprehensive way to kind of, put the whole package together and tell the story of what happened here. So the goals are to identify the remains and learn about their deaths. Who were these people? How did they die? Has the, now that they're cleaned up and in the lab, are there more visible signs of trauma that could help us understand how they might have passed away? What can we learn about their life histories from their remains, their health, their origins? Because human remains have a tremendous amount of potential to tell us about what life was like in the past. You can learn a lot about people's health and their diet. and the activities that get engaged in by looking at their bones and their genetics and things like that. So that's the next step. So we have osteological and dental analyses planned in collaboration with Yale and Quinnipiac University. Quinnipiac University is also going to be doing radiographic analyses, x-rays, and CAT scans of the remains to get more information that might be not visible to the naked eye when you examine the bones. We're also going to work with our colleagues at UConn at the Ancient DNA Lab to do genetic analyses to try and figure out if we can. It's tricky with this time period and this historical context to try and tease out, if people were British or American, basically, from their genetics, because everybody shared a very common, genetic ancestry. But there may be some hints in that data, and it may even be possible, with modern technology and the amount of data, genetic data that people are uploading through genealogy websites and things like that, to actually hone in on relatives of these people if we can, figure out who they are, which would be really amazing to be, and that would help us really get a lot closer to putting names to them, which would be, I think, the ideal goal. We're also going to look at paleoepidemiology. Are there any kind of diseases or pathogens or health issues that they have? And stable isotopic analyses, bone chemistry analyses with the University of Florida. And this is another area where you're probably most likely to get information about where these people might be from originally, because if you grew up in England, you might have different ratios of some stable isotopes than you would if you grew up in the United States, because some of that stuff gets into your bones when you're young and developing, and you can find the traces of it, even in adult remains. So they're also working on building the historical context of this. There's currently a big project going on in association with the National Park Service. They've gotten battlefield protection grants to do historical research and archaeological research on the Battle of Ridgefield. So we're learning a lot about the entire battle and pulling all that information together at a really opportune time to help provide context for these burials and help us understand better what happened there. Just really quickly, if you're interested, our colleagues in the DNA lab provided a couple of slides just talking about what they're going to be doing. If anybody's interested, I can go through them really quickly. So when you have archaeological remains, extracting and sequencing DNA from those remains can be tricky, because as the bones have deteriorated, so has the genetic material within those bones. The DNA fragments are short and damaged. But there are certain skeletal elements that preserve DNA better than others. The teeth are one, and also the petrous bone in the skull is another. So those are the elements that we'll focus on for DNA extraction. So the petrous bone is in your skull. Up here, it's very dense. It's a great source for preserving DNA. And they can do minimally invasive sampling, where they just kind of go in through the base of the cranium and take a little sample without having to cause a lot of damage to human remains, which is something that we always want to avoid, because when you're dealing with human burials, it's important to remember that they were people, they were someone's loved ones, and they need to be treated, with respect. They're not simply archaeological specimens. The other option is to do it through the teeth. So the tooth roots are the second richest source of DNA, and sometimes they can even extract that by soaking the tooth in a chemical solution and getting little bits of DNA out of it, and then replicating the material that comes out in solution. So that's incredibly uninvasive, which is a really important development in this technology. So, there's a process. Basically, they use a very tiny amount of bone. It's kind of a long timeline. It's about 4 months for lab work, 4 months for data analysis, and 6 months for pulling it all together and getting it in publishable and presentable format. But in the end, we hope that there'll be some really good information there. So, the genetic material may allow us to address some of the questions that I mentioned before. Can we identify lineal descendants or biological relatives? It'll tell us things about genetic sex and ancestry, although the sex is pretty clear from the skeletal remains at this point that we have all adult men. They can also look at and this is sort of a newer technology, looking at stressful or traumatic experience during the lives of people that can leave actual signatures at the molecular level. So, really harsh conditions like starvation and things like that can leave traces genetically, and people are starting to figure out how to get a sense of that from the genetic material. And again, this is another pathway for looking at pathogens, because you can actually look for the DNA of pathogens, the viruses, the bacteria, and things like that within the individual's remains. That will give us an additional window into the diseases that might have impacted them in life. So there's a lot of information that can be gleaned from all of this. So, moving forward, the next steps is basically trying to get some grant funding for this, working with the Ridgefield Historical Society to do that, and hopefully other organizations. We have pretty much an idea of what we need to move forward. We have a team put together, so it's really just a matter of getting the funding and hitting the ground. And hopefully we'll have answers before too long. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick and Sarah. Wow, who would have thought that such a detailed analysis would come from excavating remains that go back a couple of hundred years? And I guess now we're in the period where folks can ask questions if you'd like. I'd like to start, because I have one question. And Nick, and Sarah, you've been involved in archaeological work for a number of years. Have we had other instances of this kind of a situation where we've uncovered skeletons of human remains that go way back in time?
Oh, yeah, no. Again, like Sarah and I both mentioned, Connecticut has very acidic soil, low pH levels. As a result of that, organic remains like bones and wood do not last long in the soil. Sometimes we've seen burials that have been put in coffins. The wood's gone, but the hardware nails are still in place in the ground, and we're able to reconstruct three-dimensionally the whole coffin housing. No, we've had burials go back hundreds of years, and most of them have been in context of unmarked graves, because we really don't know where everyone's buried historically. You go to the old cemeteries in town, in your towns, and not everyone got a tombstone. Not everyone could afford a tombstone. And sometimes those tombstones were carved and placed years after the individual died. So we don't even know if they're in the same exact place where these people were. So there's a lot of question marks. If you see large gaps in cemeteries, it's not because no one's there, it's because they just never got markers. So there's a lot of socioeconomics and different things involved. But we have had many burials, unfortunately, uncovered. However, this is the first time we've ever had the possibility of a military burials associated with an actual battlefield. So that is very unique.
Very interesting. Any questions for Nick and Sarah? Sir.
So for the stable isotope analysis, you guys are, I imagine, doing C14 dating from the enamel. If the C14 comes back as being English in origin, would the skeletons be repatriated to England? And likewise, I'm not really familiar with the database we have for C14 here in New England. How good are those databases?
Okay, so let me just make sure I got it. You were talking about carbon-13, not carbon-14.
Sorry, I was not trying.
Well, there's two. There is carbon-13 and carbon-14. So carbon-14, in terms of actual dating, probably not going to be as helpful as the material culture, because we could those buttons are specific. We could really date them into the late 18th century. So that's probably as solid as we can go. With radiocarbon dating, you get how do you want to say standard deviations of a range. So it may say 200 years plus or minus 50.
Yeah.
So it's not that kind of analysis is used for older burials that go back hundreds of thousands of years when they preserve, because then at least you can get kind of in the ballpark. But for something this close to us and historically, material culture I think is going to be the best.
But with the carbon, the atmosphere of carbon, I mean, I can't remember this from my undergraduate level archaeology class. In enamel from plant matter that they ate in their lifetime would be what you're talking about. This
yeah, well, so you can do So there's a difference between C4 and C3
That's what
plants,
it is,
which is
yeah.
sort of like
C4,
tropical
C3.
versus, you know, temperate climate
Right.
plants, which can offer some information, but it's tricky in this time period because by the late 18th century, you know, I mean, food items are moving all around the world. You know, probably people here are eating a corn heavier diet, but it's certainly something that they have in Europe. So I think other types of isotopic analyses like strontium and things like that that come from like the groundwater, like where you were born, basically. You know, that might be a more useful indicator. The problem with some of those is that you have to have comparative context. You know what I mean? You have to like have a place to compare the strontium to.
Right.
You know what I mean? And things like that. So, but I think you know, what you might get from a group of people like this is, do you have similar signatures suggesting that these people all are from the same area, which is some information. And you know, there are certainly, I'm sure, reaching out, we can find comparative samples if we get, you know, those kinds of results to kind of narrow it down and figure it out a little bit tighter.
I mean, I know the databases in Britain are a lot stronger than ours over here.
So, okay, the first 20 years of your life as you grow and develop and your bones and your teeth are all growing and so forth. Okay, so you eat various plant remains, you eat animals that eat plant remains. Those nutrients and minerals that are in the soil actually become part of your skeleton. They come, what you eat, it gets embedded here, and especially with the dentition, because as your enamel forms, it forms kind of like the rings on a tree, and as it grows, it is housing that 20, up to your third molars, your wisdom teeth. It's really housing all of, so we could distinguish European soils, minerals, nutrients, and so forth, with American soils. So we could at least tell the first 20 years if they were eating a diet from Europe or they were eating a diet from America. And that might, like Sarah said, they're all Western Europeans. Whether they're Americans, maybe DNA may suggest Native American or African American, which also fought in the war. So those are very possible, and the DNA will help us distinguish that ancestry. But the stable carbon isotope may be the key in distinguishing European British and American British. It's really good stuff.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Fascinating stuff. I have two quick questions. One, is there information to form a hypothesis as to which side might have done the burials? And two, there was mention that there was no trauma. I assume that means to the bones. Would sort of flesh wounds or muscle wounds that hit an artery or a heart, would those be consistent with lack of trauma to the
Sure, it could be very easily. For example, like what the laboratory analysis will have far more detail. When I say there was a lack of trauma, I'm talking in the field. And the bones were not in really good condition, like Sarah said. We had to take some up and block. So basically, it's hard for us in the field, but we were looking for it. We were looking to see if there was anything associated with it. Now, we do know when the British came over the barricade, there was a bayonet charge. And again, bayonet going into soft tissue may or may not damage the skeletal structure. So that's another consideration. Or a musket ball that did not inflict into a bone. So yeah, we're talking skeletal, but hopefully we'll be able to see that in the lab.
Yeah, and it's possible, somebody could have been, if someone was caught with a bayonet or something like that and it just grazed a bone, there might be very faint traces of that mark that would not have been visible in the field because the dirt was coating the bone. So once they're cleaned up and they can take a closer look at them, there's, it's a much better opportunity for getting, everything will be looked at very carefully for signs of trauma, and you might find, and the X-ray and CT scan might pick up other things that you can't necessarily see just through a surface examination.
It's a good point, because the Quinnipiac will be doing CT scans on each of the skeletal elements, and they may pick up trauma that we don't see from gross morphology. So there's different ways of getting to it. Also, in terms of that bayonet charge, we know the bayonet charge occurred, and in terms of the skeletal remains, because of that clay matrix soil, the skeletal remains, again, the ribs are very thin bones, and they deteriorate very quickly, as opposed to long bones and the pelvic girdle that is thicker, has more bone density. So that lack of bone density, it could be, we may never see it because of the lack of preservation and so forth. So the lab work will be the best in terms of being able to discern that or not. And hopefully they'll be able to find something we were not able to see in the cellar.
Has there been any consideration that the pewter buttons might have been field expedient pewter bullets?
Yeah, we discussed that, and in fact, yes, we did think of that, and we were looking at it. But they're extremely flat, and even with a musket ball, they did use pewter musket balls, by the way, as well as the iron and so forth. But this was so flat, seemed to indicate more of a button, because they were making pewter buttons too. And I think basically, like Sarah said, with that supposed video or whatever that thing was, if these guys were coming off the fields, if they were coming off their farms to assist in the defense of Connecticut, they were wearing their own clothes, and some of them were. Cloth was very expensive back then, hand woven. It's not cheap like it is today. With factory made. So you held on to that stuff, and you may have repaired it with different kind of buttons or threading, whatever you needed. You kept it around. But yeah, good point, because we did consider the possibility of pewter. Right now, I can't remember. You mentioned it. Were the two pewter buttons found together?
They were both with the burial too.
Yeah, I couldn't remember.
But I don't think that there's enough metal there to make a ball, basically. I've seen impacted musket balls that are pretty flat, but there's just more to them, I guess, is what I would say.
But good thought.
Yeah.
We did think of it.
Any other questions for Nick? Major.
So, from more like a social context, are you thinking that this is all or nothing, that all four of these remains were British, or they're all American, or there could be a possibility that there's a mixture, it's field expedient to get them to the ground?
Yeah, I think it could be a mixture of both. It depends on who's, when they're doing it. Again, we know the Brits were doing that. They've done that in other battles all over the world, where again, they would strip their dead when they could do it, and bury them in shallow graves. But we have a couple of accounts where we know that a couple of Connecticutans from other parts of the state who came to help, that their bodies never came back to their families. So could this be one episode of the British doing it? Kind of unlikely, because there's no regimental markers on any of these buttons. And the British at that time had a very formal uniform, and they would have had regimental buttons. The Patriots, on the other hand, at this early stage in the war, we weren't even bluecoats yet. So we didn't have a real good formal uniform, and so as a result, it seems to indicate that they're probably American Patriots. But until as Sarah said, until all of the forensic work is done, we're still trying to figure, referring to this as a hypothesis.
And there's another.
But it's looking pretty good.
Yeah, it really is. But then, there's another aspect of it, is this kind of spatial difference where you have one burial that's by itself, and then a group of burials together. Is that meaningful? Is something that we don't know yet. It might turn out that it is meaningful. I don't know if it might have something to do with rank or status, or which side you were on, if they were separated for that reason.
And by the way, just to make it clear that if, in fact, these turn out to be victims of the Battle of Ridgefield, that they will be reburied with full military honor. So that will happen, we're hoping, in another year, maybe in 24, maybe even at the anniversary, April 27th of the Battle of next year. So we'll see what happens with, how as Sarah said, we're still raising money, and we still have a lot of research to do, but certainly I just want you to appreciate that they will be buried with the American and English governments involved.
Okay. Any other questions anybody has? Well, I want to thank Sarah and Nick for just a fascinating, explanation of skeletal remains and analysis and the steps that were taken. And I think not only giving us information about the locate, the recovery of these skeletal remains. What you've also done is helped a group of us and those who watch this film understand a little bit about what our archaeologists do, our state archaeologists. These are the two top archaeologists in the state of Connecticut. So it's quite a privilege and honor to have you folks here telling us this. And if I have anything to do with it, the next time won't be 25 years from now.
Let's do it quicker. I won't be around in 25
well,
years.
Neither will I. So in any event, thank you so much. And how about a great hand for our... Now, one of the last pieces of our programs, which we've been doing for now a number of years, and I would ask Nick and Sarah, General Heddenberg, and Christine to come forward. And we are going to give you our traditional gift, and thank you for coming to speak with us, and that's a framed copy of today's event flyer. So, Christine, Sarah,
Hey, thank you, George.
Nick, General.
That's great.
So, it's hopefully this will be a little bit of a memory of this nice thing that you did by coming to us and in our first public program since the pandemic and just talking to everybody about a very fascinating subject. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now let's see. I've got to see if I have anything left here to say to you folks. Oh, thank you to our audience for taking the time to actually be here. So we have people at our first public event. So that's very much appreciated. And why don't we give a hand to you guys? We do have some refreshments here. I know you guys have probably missed lunch, but thanks to Russ, he did get some refreshments, so please feel free to partake of that. And also feel free to look in the gallery and some of the hallways surrounding here, because we have quite it's become a fairly robust historical program. We have a number of displays here and a number of displays in the halls here and other parts of the armory, and more on the way. So, and quite honestly, a big part of making a lot of things happen these days is General Heddenberg. He's been a great supporter of our program from the beginning, and a great patron of what we do. So, I think that's it for me. Thank you very much, folks.